Colin, did you have a question? Oh, I see. Everybody's being let in. You can do it on chat if you want.
Hi, all. Thanks for being here. We will get started in just a couple of minutes. So as you're waiting, please drop your name and location in the chat so we can see where everyone is tuning in from this evening. Lakewood, Athens, Moreland Hills, Avon, Geauga. Wonderful to see so many folks from across the state. Thank you for being here. Cleveland, Columbus, Akron, Wyoming, Ohio. Excellent spread. All right, well, we will get started and go over a few housekeeping items before diving into the panel. So hello again, thank you all so much for coming. My name is Selena Cumming. I am the Communications Director for the ACLU of Ohio. This week has been a really long month, a really long year. So thank you for tuning in on a Wednesday evening and sharing some time with us as we get up to speed on what the heck is going on in Ohio and what happened in the State House. So if you're here, you probably already know that last week, the Ohio General Assembly passed Senate Joint Resolution 2. We're going to dissect exactly what happened last week, preview the upcoming August special election, and discuss how we are preparing for the big vote no effort in August. Plus, we're going to connect all the dots between these attacks on direct democracy and the Ohioans for Reproductive Freedom campaign to protect reproductive rights and abortion access in Ohio. So we've got a lot to cover. I am joined by my brilliant coworkers, Fred Levinson, our legal director, Colin Marazzi, our deputy policy director, and Gary Daniels, our chief lobbyist. So just really quick housekeeping, captioning is available. Also, if you would like to leave or pose a question for the panel at the end, please drop it in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and the chat will be open all night for you to provide commentary, and you'll see links from my coworker for relevant references, resources as we discuss the events of the past week. All right, Gary, we're starting with you. Can you please explain exactly what Senate Joint Resolution 2 is? Have we seen this type of legislation before? Was there a House version as well? Bring us up to speed on all of that.
I sure will, Selena, and thank you everybody for attending tonight. We like to share this information with you, and hopefully you leave here tonight having all of your questions answered as to what exactly is going on. So to back up the train just a little bit, there's three basic ways to change the Ohio Constitution. We can have a constitutional convention, which essentially almost never happens here in Ohio. You can have a initiative amendment process that is started by the General Assembly, that is the legislature, and that is what we have with SJR 2. And you can have citizen-led ballot initiatives that many of us are familiar with over the years as things pop up on the ballot from time to time. So you have those three basic methods of doing it, but then also, so people know, you also have referenda, which is a way for citizens to collect signatures and get on the ballot a measure to repeal an existing law. And then as well, you have what are called initiated statutes, where citizens first go to the General Assembly to get a change in state law. And that is what is currently happening with legalization of marijuana here in Ohio. And as far as referenda is concerned, those of you who've been around Ohio for a while and paying attention, I think the most popular example, notable example of that in recent memory is with Senate Bill 5 and collective bargaining for state employees. So you've got those three ways to change the Constitution. You've got slightly similar ways with regard to state law. But again, we're talking about what is with SJR2, the legislature putting something on the ballot. And that is what they're attempting to do with Senate Joint Resolution 2, which is now passed out of the legislature and will be before the ballot board momentarily. As Selena pointed out, this isn't the first time we've seen this. Indeed, over on the House side, we had House Joint Resolution 1, which was essentially the same with some slight differences that I'll get into here in a second. And then also last legislative session during lame duck, the legislature also briefly entertained House Joint Resolution 6, an earlier version of all of this. So what Senate Joint Resolution 2 would do, it does three basic things, all of which are very important and don't spell good things for the future of citizen-led ballot initiatives here in Ohio. Under current law, for Ohio voters to approve a constitutional amendment, it's a 50% plus one vote. That's it. Simple majority here in Ohio. SJR2 would change that to at least 60% of people voting as well. And those of you who have worked on ballot initiative campaigns, you know that this is the very difficult part of this process that keeps an awful lot of things from getting on the ballot in the first place. And that is the requirement to collect signatures from at least 44 of Ohio's 88 counties. You must collect at least 5% of the electorate's signatures for that. And by electorate, what I mean and what the law means is 5% of the vote of the most recent gubernatorial, that is governor's election. So 5% of those voters, percentage-wise, in 44 of Ohio's 88 counties is current law. This would change it to 88, all 88, Ohio having 88 counties, all 88 counties. And that is as bad as the 60% provision is. You combine that with this all 88 counties part of it, and you can literally have 1, 2, 3 counties essentially exercising a pocket veto over what does or does not get onto the ballot, because you can get 85 counties demonstrate extremely widespread support, but 3 counties being a holdout for whatever reason, or you just can't collect all those signatures. And it's an extremely expensive, burdensome, complex process. And so they're really telegraphing what they want to do with this and what our ability to get things on the ballot by adding this all 88 county requirement. Finally, number 3, under current Ohio law, you have, after you submit your signatures, if it's discovered that you don't have enough for reasons such as, and this pops up quite frequently, if you collect signatures, not all of them are going to be valid signatures. People move, so their registration is no longer good. They have a different address, something along those lines. They might have gotten purged, which of course we unnecessarily do here in Ohio. That keeps a lot of people from voting. So in light of all of this, under current law, you have what is known as a 10-day cure period, where you can go after it's determined that you are X amount of signatures short. You can then go have 10 days to collect more signatures so you qualify. SJR2 eliminates that 10-day cure period. The difference between SJR2 and HJR1 is that SJR2, 2 things in it will not apply until at its earliest January 1st, 2024, and that is the 88 county thing and also the elimination of the cure period. So once again, SJR2 does 3 things, from 50% plus 1 to 60% of voters, from 44 of Ohio's 88 counties to all 88 counties with regard to getting signatures to get it on the ballot in the first place, and eliminating that 10-day cure period.
Thank you, Gary. I appreciate the reminder of the 3 there at the end, because it is a lot, but it is important to know that for 2023 only the 60% provision will apply. The other two that Gary mentioned will not be in place until 2024. So with that, we are going to jump over to Colin to give us a recap of what happened last week. We know May 10th was a marathon day at the State House. So if you can color in the lines for us, that would be great.
Yeah, absolutely, Selena. And first off, I just want to echo the sentiment of my colleagues here, thanking everybody for being here on a Wednesday evening. But the headline of what happened last week was the House finally passed SJR 2, Senate Joint Resolution 2. It's important to note the timeline here. The Ohio Constitution requires any General Assembly initiated constitutional amendment to be passed by both houses 90 days before the date of the election on which they want to hold that amendment question. And 90 days before August 8th was May 10th, was last Wednesday. So that was the last day that they could get SJR 2 over the finish line. And I will say that they ran the full gambit of procedural maneuvers to get this across the finish line. HJR 1, as Gary mentioned earlier, and its accompaniment, SJR 2 had been in the General Assembly since very early on this year. HJR 1 was introduced originally in January, and SJR 2 was brought into consideration in early March. So the legislature had a lot of time to get these passed, and due to the massive amounts of opposition, public participation, that effort had stalled, and it was really up against the deadline. So a lot of things happened last week. I think first and foremost, the House Rules and Reference Committee, which is a very, under the radar committee that operates almost exclusively to just kind of be a traffic control cop in the General Assembly, deciding where bills, which committees bills go to, what bills are heard on the floor. That committee actually took the incredibly rare step of amending Senate Joint Resolution 2. This almost never happens, frankly. I can say for my time in the General Assembly, it's only less than a handful of times I've seen Rules and Reference do this. But there was enough pushback among members of the Republican caucus in the House to having an August election that it was necessary for Rules and Reference to amend SJR 2 to actually pull out the language in that resolution identifying August 8th as the election that this would occur. That seemed to get some once hesitant members to pledge their support. However, as soon as Rules and Reference made that amendment, it was made public that the anticipation was that that August election date would be rolled back into the bill once it had made it to the House floor as a floor amendment. So that seemed to be kind of just a way to limit the apprehension of some members to put it actually on the floor. Now, once we actually got to the floor on Wednesday, there were other key actions that needed to be taken in order to get SJR 2 over the finish line. Very importantly, the House Republican caucus was actually down 2 members for quite some time. One member had resigned his seat to become the director of the Department of Agriculture, and another member actually tragically passed away prematurely at a young age. So there were 2 vacant seats in the Republican caucus, and those 2 seats proved critical because in order for a resolution to pass, it must gain 3/5 support of each chamber. And in the House, that means 60 votes. And so those 2 seats were filled on Wednesday after, might I add, previously being unable to fill those seats due to an internal fighting within the Republican caucus. They seemed to kind of set that feud aside and get these 2 members seated so they could vote on this resolution. And then once those 2 members were seated, a motion was made to re-amend SJR 2, reinserting the August 8th special election, and then the vote was held. And it was a vote by 62 to 37, once again, just proving how absolutely vital it was for the House Republican caucus to seat those 2 members and get over the hump for 62 seats. Now, that was what was happening in the legislature. In the rotunda, there was a large display, a large opposition force from people across the state that came and made their voice heard. They filled the gallery. Actually, Speaker Stevens was forced to expel the members or the viewers from the gallery because of some disruptions that occurred after, re-amending the resolution for August 8th, as well as the actual, just outbursts during debate on the House floor. So what happened last week was SJR2 finally passed. Opponents continued to show up at the State House and voice their opposition. But what did not happen, and we'll get to this more in a little bit, what did not happen was the passage of accompanying legislation, Senate Bill 92, which would have allowed the General Assembly to put a constitutional amendment question on the August election ballot. Now, that'll come into play again later in the program, but that did not happen last week. They finally passed it on the last day it was able to, and here we are. We find ourselves now a week later.
Thank you, Colin. It really was a whirlwind day, and the outpouring of support for voting rights and democracy was inspiring to see the halls filled with advocates and voting rights experts alike. So now we're going to turn it back to Gary, and we're going to talk special elections. So now we all know August 8th is a day that we cannot forget. We all have to have that on our calendar. But what's exactly going on with Ohio's special election process? Didn't we just eliminate these in December? And who actually wants this on an August special election, and why?
You are correct, Selena. August special elections were largely eliminated not that long ago, just a handful of months ago. For those who might not know, as our 2-year legislature had wound up or was beginning to wind up during what's known as the lame duck period, back in December 2022, you had House Bill 458, which had been a fairly non-controversial bill during its lifetime during most of the legislative session last year, because it was devoted exclusively or almost exclusively to the issue of August special elections. There have been plenty of legislators and other people, including Secretary of State LaRose, that have decried August special elections as essentially unnecessary, expensive, burdensome to local boards of elections. We have other election dates in November, we have a primary in the spring, et cetera, et cetera. And so a lot of people have essentially thought that August special elections were unneeded and there was no big deal getting rid of them. Typically what you see in an August special election might be like a school levy or something along those lines. And so those were the people who did voice some opposition at the time. You had like the School Boards Association and township officials talking about how they didn't want it eliminated, but an awful lot of other people, this flew under the radar for many people, except that eventually House Bill 458, it became this giant election omnibus bill during lame duck with photo ID restrictions and affecting such things as provisional ballots and early voting and drop boxes and everything else. So what you have up until really, because the governor signed House Bill 458 in early January this year, it went into effect just April 7th. We've had this thing with no August special elections for not even a month and a half at this point, but then they went back to the drawing board, and all of a sudden August special elections are a good thing. We should be doing this. All of the same people that were bad-mouthing August special elections up and down for the past several months, actually the past year or two, now changed their tune awfully quickly, and now all of a sudden we need an August special election. And of course, why we do need an August special election, I have personally referred to it in testimony before. There is 1A and 1B, why they're rushing to get this done in August, and that is 1A is because of reproductive rights. 1B is because of future ballot initiatives that might address such things as, I think, in the case of 1B, gerrymandering and political redistricting. So they want to head off those two things at the pass, but primarily right now, this is about abortion. They pretend otherwise, they say otherwise, they swear up and down, many of them, that this has absolutely nothing to do with abortion. We are not fooled at the ACLU of Ohio. We do not think Ohioans are fooled, but nonetheless, that is what we are facing right now.
Thank you, Gary. Yes, we saw editorial boards from across the state, former governors, former attorney generals on both sides of the aisle call out the hypocrisy on the August special election issue. So we know that that is a rampant feeling across 250 organizations and thousands of Ohioans. And now we're going to turn it back to Colin to talk about what happens next procedurally with SJR2. We know there's an important hearing tomorrow. If you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. And yes, the next steps for the life of SJR2 are in fact quite procedural and oftentimes very mundane. However, we've seen in the past, these sort of procedural steps can, take a life of their own and become political instruments in these fights. But first and foremost, what is next on the agenda is actually tomorrow at 9:30 in the Ohio Senate. The ballot board is meeting, and the ballot board must meet. They have a constitutional duty for every constitutional amendment. They meet and they certify the ballot language that will appear on the ballots. They assign groups of individuals the task of writing arguments for and against the proposal, and then they also do other, again, sort of more clerical tasks along the way. But the highlight for tomorrow's hearing is going to be how are they going to actually formulate the ballot language and certify it? Because this is an incredibly important step in the potential success or failure of a constitutional amendment question. What is an actual voter going to read when they walk into a voting booth? This is what they're going to determine tomorrow morning. Now, the ballot board, for a little bit of background, is a board that's made up of 5 individuals, with the Secretary of State being a voting chairman of that board, but it also is comprised of 2 either elected representatives or designees of each major political party. I believe the members of the ballot board are State Senator Teresa Gavarone and an individual by the name of Walter Morgan on behalf of the Republicans. And then on the Democratic side, we have Senator Bill DeMora and Representative Elliot Forhan. Those 5 individuals will be meeting tomorrow at 9:30 a.m. This will be broadcast on the Ohio channel, so if you have a free morning and you'd like to tune in, it is live streamed, so you can follow along. But again, they will be meeting to debate and deliberate how this question should be presented to voters. And I want to say, that we have seen in the past that some ballot, questions and language can be manipulated to skew a certain way. So we will be following along extremely closely and making sure that whatever happens tomorrow will be effectively communicated to all our supporters and all our fellow opponents to SJR2, so we can get our messaging in order and let folks know how they can properly oppose this at the ballot box.
Thank you, Colin. Yes, the ACLU of Ohio will be covering the ballot board hearing on Twitter and pushing out the live stream to the Ohio channel. So be sure to follow us for any coverage and recaps there. So we just spent a lot of time talking about the political side of things. We're now going to turn to Freda in our legal corner to walk us through the litigation that was filed last week and what it might mean to stop this attack on direct democracy.
Thanks, Selena. Good evening, everybody. So last Friday, the PAC, One Person, One Vote, which is the campaign organized to oppose the 60% threshold, plus 3 individual Ohio electors, filed a lawsuit against the Secretary of State in the Ohio Supreme Court, asking the court to order Secretary LaRose to remove the 60% amendment proposed by SJR2 from the August 8th special election calendar, and to instruct county election officials to stop work on the special election. According to the Supreme Court's rules, because this lawsuit concerns an election that's scheduled to take place in less than 90 days, it's automatically highly expedited. So it's moving very quickly. The secretary filed his answer Monday. the brief of the relators, which is what you call the plaintiffs in this kind of lawsuit, is due tomorrow, and Secretary LaRosa's response is due on Monday. Both sides will file all of their evidence along with their briefs, and at that point, the case will be fully submitted to the court. There's no trial, there's no oral argument in this sort of case. The court will then have all it needs to rule. The relators are making legal arguments that the Ohio General Assembly's attempt to put the amendment on the ballot at an August special election is unlawful. They point out that Ohio statutes expressly limit special elections to November, March, and May, and they argue that August statewide elections aren't permitted in Ohio for any purpose. Statewide elections aren't permitted for any purpose. They remind the court that the OGA itself recently enacted legislation limiting August elections to political subdivisions and fiscal emergencies, as Gary just explained. And they point out that the proponents of the amendment in the legislature recognized that they couldn't declare an August election when they attempted to enact a statute to reauthorize August special elections. So all their arguments rest on sections of the Ohio Revised Code, their technical arguments. The League of Women Voters, represented by the ACLU of Ohio, is supporting this effort by filing an amicus brief tomorrow. An amicus brief is a friend of the court brief filed by a non-party that comes from an organization or individual with a perspective that has information of value to the court in rendering its decision. The League's brief will make policy decisions as to why a special election in August is undemocratic, that it allows a minority of voters to defeat the will of the majority, and how it's unworkable as a matter of election administration. It's really interesting. In their brazen threat to democracy, the proponents of SGR2 are diabolical, but they're not entirely original. Alexander Hamilton, our forefather in the Federalist Papers, recognized and spoke out against this undemocratic practice. It had been engaged in by the British Parliament, the idea of skewing election results by manipulating election dates. And this notion of skewing election results by manipulating election dates, it's akin to gerrymandering, which is skewing election results by manipulating district lines. It's just another flavor of gerrymandering. And this is not the way democracy is supposed to work. An August election also puts an untenable burden on boards of elections. It's an unusual, sudden insertion of a statewide election into the 2023 Ohio election timeline. Election officials will have to deal with the August election, even while they're in the midst of deadlines to meet for the November general election. The election calendar now has a host of overlapping requirements, and this confusion and scramble hardly benefits election integrity. So we hope the court will decide this case quickly, but there's no telling how quickly it will move. And it's far from certain that this case will be decided in our favor. So meanwhile, we must not lose our focus on the ultimate goal of defeating the 60% threshold. We need to continue to educate and mobilize voters about the 60% issue, the one person, one vote campaign. We hope the pendency of this litigation, maybe that it inspires hope, but we don't want to distract or give false hope. Our last best chance to defeat SJR2 may well be at the ballot box, not in court. Even if we prevail in the lawsuit, this still doesn't kill the threat of a 60% threshold. The lawsuit is about the legality of putting it on the ballot in August. It could come back to be placed on a later ballot. While it would no longer jeopardize our reproductive freedom amendment, it could still be a deadly threat to all future ballot initiatives, including what Gary spoke about, an initiative to reform gerrymandering prohibitions in the Ohio Constitution.
Thank you so much, Freda. And I agree, we all need to stay laser focused on the August special election. So we're turning back to Colin to talk about the lead up to that and early voting and voter ID requirements, and what do the people need to know in terms of key dates and other updates via HB 458 before they cast their ballot in August or via early voting?
Yeah, absolutely, Selena. And you're, it's really hard to describe how different of an elections environment Ohio is under now than what it was just back in November of 2022. And I think it's a a bit of poetic justice that House Bill 458, the bill that created all these new stipulations and regulations and prohibitions on the way Ohioans cast their ballot, really has proven to come back and bite the General Assembly based on what was once the very low profile question of eliminating August elections. So it seems like House Bill 458 really has it's upended Ohio for a number of different reasons. But some key dates to think of when we're looking at August 8th as a key critical election is, number one, the voter registration deadline. That puts the voter registration deadline at July 10th, and then July 11th, early voting starts that the following day. And so, we really only have less than 2 months before people and Ohioans are going to be casting ballots in this race, potentially, depending on the litigation. Another key aspect is absentee balloting. Under Ohio law, voters may request an absentee ballot up to 90 days before the day of an election. So that means right now, you can request your absentee ballot for the August 8th special election, and you can make that request all the way up until a week prior to Election Day, which is Tuesday, August 1. So if you feel especially inspired after this briefing, please go to the Secretary of State's website, download their absentee voter form, and fill it out and send it to your local Board of Elections, because they will be accepting them. Next is August 6th, which is a Sunday. That is the last day for early in-person voting for the August 8th special election. Part of House Bill 458 was that it eliminated the Monday of early in-person voting before Election Day. So we no longer have that Monday. So August 6th, Sunday, August 6th is the last day of early in-person voting. And then obviously August 8th is Election Day. Now, that's the election calendar. However, there's also a slew of different election procedures that are really in operation and that Ohio voters are going to be encountering for the first time come August. These were in effect for the May 2nd primary. However, in an off-year primary, oftentimes local jurisdictions don't have anything on the ballot. So August 8th will be, more often than not, the first time Ohioans are encountering these new provisions. And the top three of which I want to cover are really critical. The first is voter ID. So under House Bill 458, if you are going to vote in person, whether that be early or on Election Day, you must have a photo ID. And it's not just any photo ID. You have to have one of 4 specifically compliant IDs, and that is an Ohio driver's license, an Ohio state identification card, a passport, or a federally or state issued military ID. Now, I would say that there is a 5th kind of supplementary ID if you end up having to vote provisionally or you get an ID late, which is the paper printout that the BMV now gives you. That also is compliant. But without one of those 4 IDs, driver's license, state ID, military ID, or passport, you have to vote by mail. If you don't have one of those 4 IDs, you cannot vote in person, whether that be early or on Election Day. Now, a couple other caveats to that. If somebody has a suspended driver's license or ID, that is still compliant. However, if they are expired, that is not compliant. So if you would like a refresher on this new photo ID scheme, the ACLU of Ohio's Vote Center on our website has a full breakdown of resources that show what is and isn't compliant and steps that voters can take in order to obtain the compliant forms of ID. Now, I should also add that under House Bill 458, Ohio now will be issuing free state ID cards to all Ohioans, all Ohio citizens 17 years of age or older. You still need to provide the underlying documentation, such as a birth certificate, social security card, and proof of address. However, if you have those, but you don't have a photo ID, you can go to your local BMV office and get one of those at no cost to you. So I want to make sure we are aware of that opportunity. Next is voting by mail. Voting by mail, the ID requirements remain the same as under the previous scheme. So if you don't have a photo ID and you don't want to go through the process of getting a free one, you may vote by mail with only providing the last 4 digits of your social security number. However, what's really changed about voting by mail are the deadlines. And I touched on them briefly in my previous segment, but under former Ohio law, we used to have until noon on the Saturday before Election Day to request our absentee ballot. That window has now been moved to 5 p.m. on the previous Tuesday. So a full week before Election Day is the last day that you can request an absentee ballot. Additionally, on the back end of voting by mail, you still have to make sure that you put your ballot in the mail so it can have a postmark by the day before Election Day. But now your ballot can only be received by the Board of Elections up to 4 days after Election Day for it to still be considered valid. Under old law, we used to have until 10 days post-election, but now it's only 4. So what that means is get your requests in early, fill your ballot out, and get them in the mail early. If you can't do that early, then request your ballot and then go drop it in your county drop box. Now, your only counties are allowed 1 drop box, so it'll be on the property of your county board of elections. But if you would rather drop it off physically, have the confidence that it's in the ballot box and that it's going to be counted, you always have that option to drop it off in your ballot box. And lastly, I want to talk about provisional ballots. And for those that may not know, provisional ballots are ballots that voters cast when there's still questions presented as to whether or not they have a compliant ID, whether or not they're in the right polling location, whether or not their registration is up to date. It's kind of a fail-safe, or at least that was the intent when provisional ballots were created in the early 2000s. But the deadlines for provisional ballots in Ohio have also changed. Once again, post-Election Day, under old Ohio law, we used to have 7 days to return back to our county board of elections and provide whatever additional information was needed and what was forced to make you vote a provisional ballot. That deadline now has been bumped up to, again, 4 days following Election Day. So by Friday, the week of the Election Day, you have to return to your county boards of election and provide that additional information. Now, there are additional changes that House Bill 458 created. However, these 3, the photo ID requirement, the changing vote by mail deadlines, and the deadlines for provisional balloting are by far the most impactful. But if you would like a full list, please, again, go to acluofohio.org to our vote center, and we have all that information available for you at your convenience.
Thank you, Colin. Yes, we know that was a lot of information, and we are determined to make this as accessible and digestible as possible for Ohio voters. So our vote center is really clearly broken down into all the subsections. We also have hot cards that we can mail to you or your organization free of charge with the new ID requirements, because we really have our work cut out for us, not only educating about a rare special election, but this is the first time many voters will be casting a ballot under the new ID requirements. So please let us know how we can help disseminate this information to you and your networks. We're happy to do so. Okay, Freda, it's coming back to you now to talk about the Ohioans for Reproductive Freedom campaign. So as we all know, the sponsor of this radical effort said himself, the sole aim of this undemocratic proposal is to make it harder to pass the Reproductive Freedom Amendment in November. So we know we are currently in signature collection phase, full steam ahead, and our eyes are set on qualifying for the November ballot. Our signatures are due July 5th. Could you talk a little bit here about the connection between SJR2 and the abortion rights amendment, and, you know, if passed, what SJR2 could mean for our effort to enshrine abortion rights in the Ohio Constitution.
Certainly. So right now in Ohio, abortion is legal up until 22 weeks, but we should not be complacent. That status is very precarious. The sky is likely to fall in. In 2019, the Ohio legislature enacted the so-called heartbeat ban, which is also known as the 6-week ban. That law was unconstitutional at the time. Under the US Constitution, we, the ACLU of Ohio, ACLU National, Planned Parenthood, we sued in federal district court and we won an injunction against the ban before it ever came into effect. But 3 years later, the Dobbs decision came down. The legal underpinning for the federal injunction didn't exist anymore. And so that very day, the state, wasting no time, moved the federal court to dissolve the injunction. It did, and that ban sprung into effect in our state. That law very cruelly criminalizes abortion so early in pregnancy that most people don't even realize they're pregnant. And there's no exception for rape or incest victims. Many people who needed abortions lacked the means or ability to travel to other states, and they were forced to carry unwanted pregnancies. Because the exceptions to the law were vague and the law so draconian in its penalties on providers, that physicians were all too often unable to provide relief for patients in extremis undergoing excruciating miscarriages. That horrific law was in effect for 66 nightmarish days last summer until we were finally able to get relief. In the Hamilton County Court of Common Pleas under the Ohio Constitution, we won a temporary protection for abortion based on the trial judge's interpretation of our state constitution's language. But the state has appealed and appealed, and we're now in the Ohio Supreme Court. And as you know, and the state knows, the Ohio Supreme Court is composed of a majority of justices who are ideologically opposed to abortion. They won't read the Ohio Constitution the same way as the judge in Hamilton County Court. They will read the Ohio Constitution as not containing any right to abortion, and they will dissolve our injunction at their earliest opportunity. There's language in our Constitution that protects abortion, but it's high and generalized language, the same as in the federal Constitution. As soon as the Supreme Court dissolves our injunction, this is going to revive the 6-week ban, and even worse, incentivize the state to enact even more severe restrictions. A bad outcome could materialize in a matter of weeks. Of course, there's other legal strategies we're pursuing. We're fighting with everything we've got, but we're not going to be able to put off the day of reckoning forever. And ultimately, when the Ohio Supreme Court does decide whether the Ohio Constitution protects abortion, it will decide that it does not. This is precisely why we need to amend the Ohio Constitution. We need language so explicitly protective of abortion that even the most hostile of courts, like our current Ohio Supreme Court, can't interpret it otherwise. It's so clear that the timing of SJR2 on a special August election is to torpedo the Reproductive Freedom Amendment. We're making great headway in getting this amendment onto the ballot. Petitions are circulating, people are signing up energetically, and we're well on our way to getting on the ballot. Everyone knows that since the Dobbs decision, there have been numerous victories across the country at the ballot box, but even the very strongest ones have been less than 60%. In elections, a landslide is generally defined to be 60% of the vote. So while we know the majority of Ohioans support reproductive freedom, it's nearly an insurmountable burden to win anything by a landslide. So hopefully, hugely hopefully, Ohioans' outrage at these tactics can be translated into energy and used to defeat this horrible assault to democracy at the polls.
Thank you so much, Freda. The stakes could not be higher. And we know that every single issue the ACLU of Ohio holds dear and the people of Ohio hold dear is on the line here. So we have a two-pronged fight now. First, we need to defend democracy in August, and then we have to defend abortion rights in November. So we're going to channel that anger and that momentum, that energy that Freda just mentioned, pass it back to Colin. How can people plug into the Vote No effort? There is a campaign formed already. Where can people find access to information about the One Person, One Vote campaign and getting involved?
Yeah, absolutely. Selena, and I couldn't agree more with your synopsis that this is, the stakes can't get any higher than this in August. And I think what is very indicative of that fact is the breadth and depth of opposition that we have seen coalesce around this Vote No in August message. We need to remind ourselves that the opposition campaign to SJR2 really started last December, and we have maintained that momentum of picking up support and growing in our opposition against this undemocratic proposal ever since. While SJR2 was still in the legislature, over 240 Ohio-based organizations signed on to a letter formally announcing their opposition to SJR2, and that is a multi-partisan group of organizations that have signed on. Namely, chiefly among the different parties were the Ohio Libertarian Party and the Ohio Policy Roundtable, which is a conservative think tank, have all joined in with the other advocates ranging from issues such as voting rights and organized labor, reproductive freedom, multi-denominational faith leaders, education advocates, and more. We've all banded together because we know the severity and the stakes of this issue at hand. And I would be remiss to also not mention the 4 former bipartisan governors and 5 former bipartisan attorneys general who have also announced their opposition to this Democratic attack on Ohio voters. And they all echo the same talking points. This is not the way that democracies function. August elections are not the venue for this magnitude of a question to be posed to Ohioans, and all urging the General Assembly to rethink this unpopular proposal. We all know that the General Assembly did not listen, so now we have to formally transition into an actual organized campaign to defeat this. Now, the campaign has been formed. We announced our campaign on Wednesday in the Rotunda immediately following the vote, and it is the One Person, One Vote campaign, and it has a website where everybody can go to get the latest news and updates on it, and that website is votenoinaugust.org. That is the One Person, One Vote campaign's website, and I would direct anybody here who is interested in getting involved, staying up to date, or just generally being in the know to visit that website, bookmark it on your home screen. Now, for ways that groups can plug in, first and foremost, there is an endorsement form on the votenoinaugust.org website. If you are a member of a statewide, regional, or local nonprofit organization or any organization, please, you have the ability to add your organization's name to the growing list of endorsements for the One Person, One Vote campaign. And there you can also sign up to be alerted when there are days of action, when there are important updates resulting from the litigation or just the general campaign schedule. Now, I would also like to highlight there is in fact a donate button. There is a donate button on the votenoinaugust.org website, and I cannot stress enough how critical financial support is to the success of this campaign. And the reason I say that is because we are going against a very small, select group of very wealthy special interest organizations from across the country. I think everybody here remembers that when the news broke in the Columbus Dispatch that a Illinois-based political mega donor was the lone benefactor of the PAC that was pressuring members of the General Assembly to pass SJR 2. We know that the anti-choice organizations, their coffers are full and they are gearing up to spend huge in this election. We know that Second Amendment organizations are gearing up, as well as the business groups among the state. Now, luckily, those are the only groups who have announced their support for this measure, indicating just how truly unpopular this is. However, those organizations have deep pockets and they have a lot to lose if SJR 2 goes down in defeat in August. So please consider making a donation if you have the means. If not, just sign up to receive campaign updates and days of action updates as well. But another great way to plug into this campaign is simply to spread the word that there is potentially an election in August, to get that on people's radar, to share with them the new election calendar and voting requirements, including photo ID. Arm people with the tools and the information so they can make their voting plan and they are aware of, again, this absolutely critical question that is being posed to Ohio voters in August. This is going to be a turnout election. So we need to get the word out quickly. And we know that if we get the word out to our supporters, we win. We know if we can't get the word out and our messages to our supporters, we potentially lose. So this is going to be an effort that we all need to band together and make sure that we are having every conversation with every person we meet, telling them to vote no in August.
Thank you so much, Colin. I am very inspired to cast my no vote today after that speech, so thank you. Amazing round of commentary by our panelists. We're now going to turn to the Q&A. We have some great questions already in the chat. First one is to you, Gary. This is from Stephen, and he said, could you please explain the issue regarding the fact that the vote last week was on a resolution and not a regular bill?
Sure, and this is something that understandably confuses people who are fortunately not tasked with paying attention to this stuff in great detail on a daily basis. And so, as I had mentioned at the very top of this event, there are a few ways to amend the Constitution here in Ohio, and one of those is when the legislature does it as they've done it with SJR 2. But the only way the legislature can do this under the law is by passing a resolution that is approved by at least 3/5 of each chamber, the Senate and the House. So there's no other mechanism for them to do that except by a resolution. I think what might confuse people sometimes with regard to that is sometimes resolutions are kind of essentially meaningless declarations by the General Assembly about all kinds of matters. I've seen resolutions about encouraging Congress to repeal this law or pass this law. I've seen resolutions encouraging a United States Constitutional Convention, but they are also used here in Ohio to formally, as part of a formal process, get something on the ballot. And for those of you who are curious, I think in the world of civil liberties land, there is plenty to blame on Governor DeWine for a variety of things, but with resolutions, those never go to the governor. Those are only approved by the House and Senate. So just a little piece of nuanced trivia for all of you following along.
Thanks, Gary. Our next question is for you, Colin. It's from Andrew. He said, are you concerned that the language for the ballot could mean that we have to change our messaging to yes, depending on what happens tomorrow morning? And will the amendment process be left the way we expect it to be, or what shenanigans could happen tomorrow morning?
Well, great question. And I guess I would say, just to give people on here a bit of background of what kind of manipulation can occur when the ballot board sets the language. If folks remember, back in 2018, issue 1 in the May primary had to deal with decriminalizing some drug possession charges and changing the way that those arrests were essentially sentenced. I believe back when it was Secretary of State John Husted, when he was the chair of the ballot board, the first sentence in the explanation for that constitutional amendment was to allow individuals with lethal levels of fentanyl to not be incarcerated. So that's the kind of skew that can come about from this ballot language. Now, I don't know what the ballot board is going to do. I don't have a crystal ball. I wish I did. However, we are highly aware that the proposal is unpopular, and we know that there is an incentive for the supporters of SJR2 to kind of concoct a way to get more yes votes for their side. I'm not saying this will happen. I'm just saying that, we are aware and we're watching. We've actually been strategic about this. That's why what all of our messaging has been so far is, it's been vote no in August. We haven't linked it to, vote no on issue 1 or issue 2 or anything like that, to preserve our ability to adapt our messaging once we know what the ballot board concludes. So this is one of those aspects where, we don't really know what's going to plan out, but we think we've been successful in laying the groundwork to be able to adapt to anything that happens tomorrow.
Thanks, Colin. So Freda, the next question is near and dear to your heart about our gerrymandered supermajority in the Ohio legislature. We had a question that says, who is responsible for this if there are so many Ohioans who oppose it? So do you want to just tee up a home run pitch about the situation we find ourselves in?
Yeah, unfortunately, our state legislature is not representative of the voters of our state because it is gerrymandered. The districts are drawn in such a way as to skew the election results so that a minority of voters or a small majority of voters get a large majority in the legislature. So the legislature is extreme and non-representative. And that's precisely why we need this vehicle of being able to have citizen initiated ways to change the laws, because the legislature won't do it for us. Because the legislature is passing laws that most Ohioans disagree with, for instance, limiting abortion, restricting, criminalizing abortion. We need to, we, the people, need a mechanism of changing the law. Our legislators are representing themselves, not their constituents. Same with joint Senate Resolution 2. This is not what the people of Ohio want. This is what legislators trying to perpetuate themselves and their power want to have, and they are forcing their will upon their constituents because they can, because we are gerrymandered.
Thanks, Freda. Gary, this is back to you now. We mentioned that this SJR2 extreme proposal doesn't only impact the future of reproductive rights. Can you talk about what kind of other issues might be considered in the future that the people would want to bring to the ballot and how this could impact them?
Sure. So reproductive rights have been mentioned, future efforts to combat and end political gerrymandering have been mentioned. The thing to remember, I think that's important for people to know, is that getting something on the ballot in Ohio is pretty uncommon in the first place because it's so difficult and expensive to do right now. And that's only one part of it. To get things on the ballot is one thing. To run a successful campaign then is quite another thing. Ohio is a diverse state politically. We have a mix of media markets spread across the state. This isn't like, for instance, Illinois, where you have Chicago and everywhere else. In Ohio, you've got such a mix of big cities, smaller cities, rural areas, suburban areas, that it makes us very diverse. And as people know, a relative bellwether for a lot of things socially across the country. So right now, what's being discussed and considered, I know there's an attempt to get minimum wage on the ballot. I know some people for some time in the future are hoping to get something involving qualified immunity with regard to government officials, particularly police, and how they operate, and what essentially legal excuses they can use should they find themselves violating the law or people's rights. And anything else that people might think should be on there. But anybody who gets involved in this issue, they already know how much of a hurdle it is to do this, which is why I think Colin has a better memory for these things than I do. But if I remember correctly, there hasn't been anything on the Ohio ballot since 2018. That's almost 5 years that nobody has placed anything on the ballot, which gives you an idea of how rarely people undergo this type of process. You go back farther than that, the last 10, 15, 20 years, you're still not talking about a whole lot. And some of those things that have ended up on the ballot for people to vote on to change the Constitution are just like SJR2. That is, they were proposed by the General Assembly in the first place. So just my pitch to people to say the reason you don't see a lot of things right now and people considering this is because of the difficulty, the complexity, the expense, and everything else.
Thank you, Gary. Colin, another question about the one person, one vote campaign. We know that there's lots of organizations signed up and lots of activists and voters across the state fired up. So do you have any preview of what's next from the campaign of how folks can, get involved and how they might be running the Unified Vote No effort? Or just how we can get the word out more effectively if people haven't heard about this, and some paid media that might be coming later this summer.
Yeah, absolutely, Selena. And first off, let me just say, I think we should all stand a little, pretty confident in the campaign. Yes, it is formulated by over 200 different organizations from multiple different issues that, one may not think they, can really coalesce around a single thing. And I will just say, we have seen them do exactly that. This same group of organizations that stand resolved to defeat this issue in August, we almost beat this issue in the General Assembly when they have every mechanism available to them. They have the numbers by far, and we almost defeated it in the General Assembly. Now, there's no such thing as moral victories in politics. However, I can say here confidently that there has been a concerted effort to develop a winning strategy, a winning plan. And what we all can do right now at this very moment, again, what I talked about not too long ago. One, if there's a way to financially contribute, I would think that would be the most impactful way, because we are going to be running a condensed election campaign. This is going to be over in 85 days now. So we need resources to compete with our opposition. I believe that we will obtain those resources, but we also need to, win the word of mouth battle, because we do have that broader base of supporters on our side. We need to win that word of mouth battle. And that starts, today. That starts when you're at the grocery store. That starts when you're at church this weekend. Talking to your neighbors and friends and family about, just putting this on their radar and letting them know that there is going to be an election in August. Oftentimes, this was the entire debate around House Bill 458 and around SJR2. People do not expect an election in August. This will be the first question posed to Ohio voters to change the Constitution in August since 1926. So this is a very unique situation we find ourselves in. Now, I know that that doesn't really seem, sexy or anything at this moment, but we are laying the foundations for a successful campaign. And I feel confident in the team that is leading the campaign. And I feel confident in their ability to lead a unified campaign with a unified message to vote no in August. Again, because we really don't have another option. And it's going to come down to who has the resources to get their message out, to touch their supporters multiple times, whether that's door to door, whether that's via texting, whether that's via direct mail, and that all takes money. So I understand we're still very early, but the finish line is not that far ahead. So we will be moving full steam ahead with both, paid communications as well as, beating the pavement, walking in parades on July 4th weekend, letting people know that, that this election is happening and letting them know what the stakes are.
Thank you very much, Colin. All right, Gary, there was some chatter last week that, we had mentioned to media. We saw legal analysis is mentioning the resolution itself and adding an election provision into the resolution. Can you talk about how that may or may not be unconstitutional? And then we'll have Freda add anything else in about our amicus brief.
Sure, I'll be happy to tag in Freddie here to talk about the litigation, but this is really a follow-up to Stephen's question in the chat. I misunderstood what you were essentially asking with regard to the resolution, but it gets to this idea for those of you who have been following this especially closely. Can the legislature set an election date via a resolution, merely a resolution, or do they have to do it by passing a law and changing the Ohio Revised Code, which is the collection of state laws that we live under? Our contention is that they must do this via state law, not resolution. The General Assembly, for a little while now, has wanted to make it under law quite crystal clear that the only party, essentially, that has the authority to set election dates, and this was a controversy during the early days of COVID, but they wanted to be quite clear that the only body that has the authority to set election dates is, after all, the General Assembly. I don't find that controversial, and it became part of House Bill 458, as we have discussed. I know they are trying to rely on some case law that existed prior to passing this change that required the General Assembly only to do it. So that makes it, I think, distinguishable from the case law that they seem to be relying on. But I refer to myself as Justice Daniels internally, even though I have never spent a minute in law school except to come speak to students. So I'm going to turn it over to our super litigator, Freda, who can give you a much better and expert answer than I can.
I don't know if it's better or more expert than Justice Daniels, but I can just add, and maybe this is getting too much in the weeds, but there seems to be some interest in this. The relators in the lawsuit, the people that are arguing the law in the Ohio Supreme Court on this, have pointed out to the court that the statutory scheme in Ohio, the scheme that sets when elections can be, has no provision for an August special election, other than in this very particular situation of a municipality in fiscal emergency. And the legislature tried to change this case law with this joint resolution. And so the question is, can a resolution change statutes? And the thing is, in Ohio, there's a basic principle of law that says you can't change statutes with a resolution. There's a very ancient case. It goes back to the 1800s. I think it's from 1897 that says that. And that argument is made by the relators in their papers.
And if I can add something real quickly, I think I misspoke and said that the change for only the General Assembly can set these dates was part of House Bill 458. I thought about it after I said that, and I don't think it was part of House Bill 458. It was legislation pre-458. Nonetheless, the General Assembly passed a law giving themselves exclusive authority to do this, which again, I think is really non-controversial. Colin mentioned before the irony of them doing things that then come back to bite them. And this is perhaps one of those types.
Thank you for that clarification, Gary. And I think we have time for just one last question now, Freda. Alyssa asked in the chat if we think the one person, one vote lawsuit will be successful. I know you said we are very hopeful, but we also know the venue we're in. So if there's any final point you want to make on that.
Yeah, Selena, I think you summed it up. We're, very hopeful, but we have to consider who's making the decision here. And there is no appeal from that court. They hold the cards and they will determine the result. So we need to proceed with as if we're going to lose and to get ready to defeat the 60% thing at the polls in August.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much to Freda, to Gary, Colin, amazing, brilliant panel discussion tonight. We know that we have an intense 6 months ahead of us for our state. There are really two futures that Ohio could be facing. We have two huge fights ahead of us. So thank you all so much for tuning in, learning a little bit more about what the summer and fall will look like and how you can join the ACLU of Ohio in voting no in August and yes in November. You will be hearing much more from us in the coming months via email and social media and the news media. So please let us know if you have any questions. We are always here to help you get up to date on this information. With that, enjoy the rest of your Wednesday evening and please tell all your friends to vote no on August 8th. Have a good night.
Thanks, everyone.